There is a curve in endurance physiology that explains almost everything about why you get fitter or why you stop. It's why walking can completely transform a sedentary person, but won't budge the VO2 max of a trained person. It's why I hiked 2,600 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail, literally walked from Mexico to Canada, and my aerobic engine didn't explode the way that you'd think. And it's the same curve that decides whether your training is actually pushing you forward or just keeping you busy today. So I want to talk through that curve, the three variables that actually matter in endurance training, and how to build a plan that works for you and your performance without hijacking your entire life. Welcome back to the Funspan podcast. I am Jack Muslinski. I'm a graduate student in applied physiology, a running coach, and an ultra athlete. Part of what's so attractive about endurance sports is that it makes you faster, but it also makes you healthier. So today's episode is about how to use that intelligently, not at the level of run 4 times a week and do a long run because you've heard all the basics. This is about the underlying theory, the lens through which you can view any plan, any fad, any workout that you see on Instagram. So let's start with one simple idea. Adaptation defines outcome. You don't get the body you want, the performance you want. You get the adaptation that matches the stress that you consistently give your body. And that stress is the signal. And that's what I'm going to call targeted stimulus. If your stimulus is targeted, if it matches your goal, you get the outcome that feels aligned with your process and you'll start to enjoy it. You'll see progress in the direction that you care about. And that's where exercise can become a source of fulfillment. If your stimulus is random or inherited or based on someone else's goals, you just do the class your friend told you to do, the workout the algorithm served you, your outcomes will be just as random and inherited as well. And that's where the classic modern mismatch comes in. Someone whose stated value is I want to be active and healthy in my 80s, but whose training is entirely driven by aesthetics or likes or whatever the friend group is currently working on. There's nothing wrong with that, to be clear. There's nothing wrong with wanting to look good. I'm not anti-aesthetics. But if every decision in your training life is driven by, will this make my abs pop more in photos? That's a very different targeted stimulus than, will this give me a bigger aerobic engine, stronger connective tissue, and a heart that ages slower? So those are two very different games, and they create different outcomes. We need to engineer our stimulus around those outcomes. Another version of the same mismatch that's even more common is someone trains exclusively with high intensity interval classes because they're efficient with their time and maybe they do get fitter in the specific way that their stimulus trains. Higher glycolytic tolerance, better short duration output, maybe a little bit of weight loss from the increased activity. But if their stated goal is I want to backpack Patagonia or I want to hike all day without my hips and feet falling apart, very different stimulus. Again, different outcome, because Patagonia isn't a 45-minute sufferfest. It's about hours of sub-maximal work, tissue durability, and steady fuel management. And this is where a lot of the arguments online come from, because that doesn't mean that high intensity interval training is bad. It means that it's a tool that can serve your purpose, your job, your outcome that you're looking to fulfill. So the first Funspan question that any good training theory aims to answer is, what outcome do I actually want? And then just underneath that, what stimulus can I apply to get there? Because once you pick the outcome, your training becomes a physics problem. Stress into adaptation into your desired outcome. And that's where endurance gets really fun and why I enjoy being a coach, because we can map the main variables that matter and reverse engineer for the outcome that you want. In my personal view, and borrowing heavily from people that I've learned from, like Olaf Alexander Boo, David and Megan Roche, and Inigo San Millan, there are 3 big variables in endurance training: metabolic efficiency, economy, and fatigue resistance. You can think of these as the 3 corners of your endurance triangle. And any stimulus that you apply along your fitness curve, meaning your output at different intensities, is going to be aimed at also improving these 3 variables. So let's unpack them. Metabolic efficiency is the big one. This is how much power you can produce at a given intensity and what fuels you use to do it. If I put you on a bike or a treadmill and slowly ramp things up, metabolic efficiency is how much oxygen you can use, how much lactate you produce versus how much you clear, how effectively you can burn fat at lower intensities and spare glycogen for later. This is the variable that's most tightly connected to health and longevity. VO2 max, lactate thresholds, your ability to hold decent output without crashing, those track very closely with longevity and disease risk. And as we've all heard by now via our Instagram feeds, VO2 max is a measure of your cardiorespiratory output at a specific point along the curve, and it's the best correlate that we have with your lifespan. And we can measure all of this. If we drop you into a metabolic cart regularly and look at your calorimetry, what fuels you're burning at different efforts, that would tell us way more about your long-term health than your race PRs. And that's where the science diverges slightly from the fast race equals being healthy crowd. Yes, that's true to a certain extent, absolutely. But race performance is determined also by your specific economy and your fatigue resistance, which are a little bit separate from just health outcomes and much more directly aligned with how you'll perform in a race setting, which of course, race performance can be a part of healthy goals. And it's important to look at those variables as well. But we can understand a little bit more specific detail if we look at what's going on under the hood. So then we have specific economy, and it's going to be specific to the sport that you're doing, whether it's running, cycling, Nordic skiing. Each of them have this variable of all the energy that you're burning, how much actually turns into forward motion. You can think of this pretty cleanly by thinking about swimming. I, for one, have terrible mechanics and form and not much experience swimming. And I might be super metabolically efficient in my muscles, but if I don't have the technique that can actually use that energy to propel me forward, then I'm not going to go anywhere. And swimming's just one example, but every sport has this. Even in running, there are very specific small muscles and tendons in your lower legs that will increase your elastic recoil and are very important for, again, turning your energy into forward propulsion. So if you think about it, two people can run the same pace with wildly different energy demands. One is flailing around and chopping the ground, and the other one looks like they're floating, like a gazelle. So economy is technique, yes. Tendon stiffness and elastic recoil, for sure. Neuromuscular coordination. How well is your brain telling which muscles to fire? Recruiting the right structure at the right time. And you can think of it as how expensive is each step. Third, we have fatigue resistance. This is how long you can hold on to your economy and your metabolic efficiency before things start to fall apart. And the longer the race distance, the more important this variable becomes. It's why two people can both absolutely cruise through 10 miles of a marathon feeling great, but at mile 23, one of them still looks like themselves and the other looks like they've never run before, and it becomes very mechanical. So fatigue resistance shows up as maintaining pace deep into a session or a race, maintaining form and technique under stress, and being able to come back tomorrow and do it again. So those are the three variables. The important takeaway is that all three of these are trainable. Often, yes, a lot of the workouts that you see will hit all three at once. But if you want specific race or health outcomes, it's important to think about each variable independently. Metabolic efficiency is the number one, most important, all about health and performance. Economy and fatigue resistance are mostly about your performance outcomes. So the beautiful thing is when we look at real world training and it hits multiple of these variables at once, we see that the system is integrated. And you can see that if you look at stimulus first, you can see what the response is in your body specifically. So to really understand why certain workouts work and why others are just kind of noise and busy work, we have to talk about that curve that I mentioned at the beginning, the fitness curve. Picture this. On the x-axis, intensity. from easy walking to all out sprinting can be categorized by your heart rate zones, your lactate levels, or your rate of perceived exertion. And on the y axis, you have output or performance. So that's your pace, your power, your useful work at a given intensity. So the natural shape of this curve is sloped upwards and to the right, because as you go up in intensity, you can produce more work. But the crux of the question around endurance theory is, how do we adapt the fitness curve to meet our health and performance goals? How do we choose our stimulus to shape our fitness curve to do what we want it to do? So if you're looking at overall fitness and shifting the curve upward, increasing volume makes a huge difference, even at low intensities, and especially if you're relatively untrained. If you've been relatively sedentary for a long time and you start walking for just 1 hour a day, your curve will shift upwards. Your zone 2 power rises quickly because your baseline was relatively low, and that stimulus will effect a huge change. But that relationship is not linear forever, and this is where a lot of, if you're ever spending time on fitness Twitter, the debate around walking as effective endurance or aerobic training comes in. Because at some point, if you keep adding more low intensity volume, your returns will diminish. You can run more hours or walk more hours, but your power at that intensity will stop rising and the curve starts to flatten. And that's the key in a place where a lot of athletes I see get tripped up, because power at zone 2 does not increase forever just because you keep adding more zone 2. And we'll get into more a little bit about how some people see zone 2 as the holy grail and where maybe we're just talking past each other. But if you reach that plateau and you want to keep improving, you'll often have to train further out the fitness curve at higher intensities so that lower intensities become relatively easier and more productive again. And it's easy to get stuck there, going from more easy volume works to I need to explore different areas along the x-axis of my fitness curve. I experienced this sort of plateau from lower intensity work firsthand very recently, where you're doing a lot of work, you're tired in the normal way, you feel trained, your fitness tracker data looks great, but you're not actually getting any faster or fitter at the same effort. So it looks like you're paying the rent, but you're not really building any equity to show for it. This happened to me just 6 months ago on the PCT. From the outside, hiking 25 to 30 miles a day looks like the ultimate aerobic work. My watch, my Whoop said that I was putting in all this time. Time on feet was absolutely maxed out because I'm going 12 to 14 hours a day. Steps are maxed out, 50,000 steps, load is through the roof. And yet when I finished and came home, my VO2 max and performance in zone 2 wasn't higher. My threshold wasn't much higher than where I started. And not only that, but my sharpness at higher intensities, at least especially in running, slid backwards. Why is that? It's because for my fitness level at that time, the hiking intensity became a level where it wasn't sufficient overload. It was a ton of volume and stress, yes, but clustered in one region of the curve that my body had already fully adapted to. When my zone 2 became walking uphill with a pack, there was no further overload to achieve on a normal day. To contrast that, my dad joined me for a week right there at the end. He had a much lower baseline cardiorespiratory fitness than me, and he was doing the same terrain and the same hiking. And for him, it was a massive overload. His curve absolutely shifted. Same hike, but completely different adaptation based on where we were at. So training isn't just about the workout that you did. It's what you did relative to your current capacity. And in training theory and exercise science, this is called the overload theory. If you're a beginner runner, easy jogging is a huge stimulus, and the curve shifts super quickly because everything is improving at once: breathing, heart function, mitochondrial signaling, confidence. Whereas for a trained athlete, adding 30 more minutes at a very low intensity zone can definitely be useful. And it is often, it's an important part of training. Improves durability, your recovery, your total volume and mileage, but it might not move your metabolic efficiency directly all that much, which means, again, depending on your race performance and health goals, it might not be moving your fitness curve where you want it the most. So the beginner, as I was just 6 or 7 years ago, here's you can just do zone 2 and get better, and it absolutely changes their life. And this is where I got hooked on endurance training, because I learned about all the biological benefits, and I went out for just 45 minutes a day or less and saw massive gains. I experienced runner's high for the first time. I realized that you don't just have to go all out to enjoy the activity itself, and it completely shifted my perspective. So again, the zone 2 thing is useful. But once you reach that fitness level that you've achieved from that training, you start to branch out a little bit depending on your goal. A 5K athlete needs a bigger ceiling and better economy at higher intensities. A marathoner needs to push threshold and fatigue resistance. And an ultra runner needs a massive base and crazy fatigue resistance, which nowadays ultra runner coach Scott Johnson, who coached Tom Evans and Ruth Croft at the UTMB, is calling durability. But anyways, it's beside the point. And so none of these athletes are getting away from the fundamentals that you hear often that are important for training, but they're specializing in different parts of the curve and different corners of that triangle, that 3-variable formula. So we have our 3 variables: metabolic efficiency, economy, fatigue resistance. And now we have the curve that explains where volume is productive depending on your goal and where it levels off. But how do we now use this understanding to build an effective plan? So in the next episode, we'll take this model and actually build an effective training week around it. How volume, the long session, threshold work, intervals, and recovery all fit together so that this works in real life, in application, not just in theory. Because if you zoom out, that curve that we talked about, the fitness curve, and those 3 variables explain almost everything about why endurance training works and when it stalls. The same workout can be a breakthrough for one person and maintenance for another, based purely on where they sit on the curve and how the profile of it is unique to them. So we'll explore how to look at your specific curve, your goals, and the stimulus that you can use to achieve them. Because having the right model is step 1, the fitness curve and these 3 variables, and knowing which dials to toggle. But using it well is the rest of the game. Thanks for tuning into this episode. See you next week for that. Keep going.